What's it like to live inside an anime? Having grown up on a healthy dose of anime shows as a kid, and well into adulthood, I've always wondered what it would be like to live inside one of these fantastical worlds. When I got my PSVR 2 headset last Christmas, I felt like I finally had an opportunity to answer that question, and set out to find some games that could replicate the anime experience. In terms of video games, the genre that probably best captures the look and feel of anime is JRPGs, since they share many of the same visual styles, stock characters, and story tropes. That was also my favorite genre as a kid, especially the classic Final Fantasy games, and so that's the type of game I was hoping to play in VR. Unfortunately, I didn't find much of anything that fit the criteria, at least not in the PSVR 2's library. The PSVR 1 seemed to have at least one clear-cut JRPG, and that's The Legend of Heroes: Trails into Reverie. But as I understand it, the VR part only consists of two optional scenarios that aren't necessary to complete the main story. So, it sounds like the VR component was more of an add-on than a complete gameplay experience. In any event, this game isn't available on the PSVR 2, so it was out of contention. After scrolling through several games that seem to broadly fit what I consider the anime art style, colorful wardrobes and exaggerated features like ridiculously large eyes, the game I decided was the best candidate is Dyschronia Chronos Alternate. Now, this is not an RPG. If anything, it's more of a combination of a visual novel and a puzzle game, but in terms of story, setting, and characters, it does have a similar feel to an anime. The game is set in a post-apocalyptic world that has been rendered almost entirely uninhabitable by a global catastrophe that happened some years prior, with only tiny pockets of human civilization scattered across the globe. Almost the entirety of the story takes place in one of these surviving cities, a place called Astrum Close. Visually, the city is quite appealing in VR. You've got this wide-open city center surrounded by a bunch of different buildings and structures, like a clock tower and a gondola. But it's eerily empty, completely devoid of people and all living things except for the occasional birds flying by. The only time you meet people are inside of buildings or inside of Augmented Dreaming. Augmented Dreaming, or AD, is this kind of virtual reality where most of the population of Astrum Close resides. The analogy that most immediately comes to mind is being plugged into the Matrix. The citizens are suspended in a state of perpetual dreaming, which alleviates all mental illness and has reduced crime in the city to near zero levels, creating a kind of virtual utopia. The problem is that most of the citizens of this city that you meet in-game, in other words the NPCs, aren't fully rendered. They all have this kind of weird blue silhouette with a glowing white ball inside of them. In Augmented Dreaming, this appearance makes more sense because what we're supposed to be seeing is the virtual representation of people who are in stasis. So these ghastly avatars could just be projections of their sleeping selves. But when you're walking around the waking world, and it's full of either vacant spaces or empty NPCs, it does feel like the developers just didn't have the budget or bandwidth to create a fully realized world with fully rendered NPCs. The character models for the 10 or so main characters are fully rendered, and they do have your kind of standard anime stylizations. There's the Bishonen partner, grizzled older adventurer, tomboy scientist, comatose love interest, gender ambiguous android, and annoying mascot.
Help! I knew it. This doesn't sit right with me. I'm worried, mister.
On that last point, please just note that you may find the mascot Lily to be really annoying. She follows you around everywhere to offer advice and points you in the right direction, but her constant high-pitched whining gets old really fast. If you've ever played Persona 5, you may understand what I'm talking about because lots of people feel the same way about Morgana. I don't want to get too into spoilers, but it's difficult to talk about the gameplay without mentioning some parts of the story since they're so intertwined, but I'll try to skim on the details as much as possible. You play as Hal Scion, who's investigating the murder of the city founder, Professor Rumford. As I mentioned earlier, crime is essentially non-existent in this city, so for something like a murder to occur is pretty disruptive to the collective consciousness of the citizenry. In addition to being a detective, Hal also serves as something of a therapist, tasked with going into Augmented Dreaming, finding people that are upset, and lulling them back to sleep. It's pretty easy to spot these people because they're bright red, which means that they're in a state of mental distress and it's up to you to fix them. From a gameplay perspective, this basically consists of playing a memory game where you watch a ball of light bounce between a bunch of panels and then push those panels in the exact same sequence. This starts off pretty easy but becomes more difficult later on as both the speed of the ball and the number of buttons increases. It also gets tedious rather quickly, and that's unfortunate because visually, the Augmented Dreaming sequence of the game is by far the most impressive. It's a colorful laser light show filled with all sorts of aquatic creatures that are supposed to represent the sleeping citizens of the city. Even talking to the NPCs is fun because a lot of times they reveal things about their own anxieties, which cracks the fragile facade of this illusory peacefulness. The whole thing comes across as a surreal and colorful daydream. So, in summation, AD is where the visuals of the game really shine, even if the gameplay is pretty tedious. Fortunately, most of the AD part of the game is also optional, so you can mess around in it at your leisure. By contrast, the real world, like I mentioned earlier, is pretty bland from a visual perspective, but this is also where a majority of the story takes place. The story is split into 3 episodes. You get all 3 with the digital purchase. Just be careful if you buy a physical copy of the game because the disc only contains the first episode, and the DLC for the next 2 episodes might be region locked. The gameplay mostly consists of walking around, talking to the main characters, and scanning items. All of this will add information to your investigation log, revealing character backgrounds and plot details that will help you to solve the murder mystery. Some of these items will also send you back in time, giving you the ability to alter past events to change the future. As is the case with many other stories involving time travel, the plot can feel a bit confusing and disjointed at times, which in typical sci-fi fashion is explained away with a lot of indecipherable technobabble. Nonetheless, traveling through time to alter the past so that you can solve a crime in the present is a pretty cool narrative device, and the story was probably my favorite part of this game, even if I didn't completely understand it. The single biggest problem I had with this game is that you can't auto-skip any of the dialogue or cutscenes. Instead, you have to sit there and mash the X button to get through all of the talking. And since this is a Japanese anime-style visual novel, there is a lot of talking. It's not so bad the first time you have to sit through the dialogue, but the time travel nature of the story means that you find yourself repeating scenes of dialogue with no easy way to skip through them. That was really annoying when I was going through the game to capture gameplay footage for this video. It may sound like I'm mostly hating on this game, but it wasn't all bad by any stretch of the imagination. For the most part, I actually enjoyed it. My disappointment stems from the feeling that it could have been so much more. I just played through Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and I couldn't help but think what a game like that would be like in VR. Now, I know that getting a game that big onto VR presents all sorts of technological and logistical challenges, but I'm not even talking about the size of the game, so much as the experience. When I think back to classic Final Fantasy games, like the OG Final Fantasy VII, it's incredible to think of how much Square pushed the boundaries of existing technology in order to create the greatest game experience possible. Jeremy Jahns made a great analogy when he said that Nobuo Uematsu, composing the soundtrack to Final Fantasy VI on the Super Nintendo, would be like Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel with Crayola crayons. If Square could create on primitive 16-bit hardware what is arguably today still the greatest JRPG of all time, then I don't see why the same couldn't be done with the VR technology of today. VR is already visually the most immersive experience you can have with gaming. It just needs something in the way of story and gameplay that's equally immersive. A game that uses the technology as a way to further enhance an already great game, rather than relying on the gimmick of the technology itself to carry a half-finished tech demo. Dyschronia doesn't really fall into either of those extreme examples. It's not a great game, but it's certainly not a bad one either. And I do want to commend the developer, My Dearest, for releasing not 1, but 3 games that attempt to immerse you in a virtual anime world. Dyschronia is actually the 3rd game in the Chronos series, and I do intend to play the previous 2 titles, Tokyo Chronos and Alt Deuce Beyond Chronos, at some point in the future. However, for now, my journey to find a VR game that truly feels like an immersive anime experience continues. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe, because I do plan to continue making VR videos, and I may even make a series out of this particular topic where I try VR games with an immersive anime experience. So if you have recommendations for any such games, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.